أهلا وسهلا بالجلسة الثالثة والأخيرة اليوم بعنوان Living Every Day with an Endangered History Tools for Documentation and Dissemination. أظن إنه الثلاث مداخلات رح تكون بالإنجليزي. رح نبلش مع ماريا. Maria Abu Nasser. Maria is a historian with a degree in Middle East Public and Oral History. She is based in Beirut and works as an independent scholar and an oral history consultant. Her book, We Are in This Together, An Oral History of Ras Beirut, is slated for publication with AUB Press in 2018. Please, Maria.
Thank you. So I'm speaking in English, unfortunately, but I enjoyed very much learning about your projects in the previous presentations. Today I'm going to be talking about oral history, Ras Beirut, and Madrasat Sit Amini, or Sit Amini. And basically I'm going to be reading just because I'm going through a lot of information and I don't want to get off track, but I hope that it will be lively. And a PowerPoint presentation. So basically oral history or Tarikh al-Shafawi is really a cumbersome term to describe both a practice and a theory. But in the context of this seminar or workshop, oral history is a practice that is really fundamental to remembering, archiving, and disseminating narratives threatened with erasure. While oral history's significance might be obvious to all of us, it's really worth emphasizing just a few points about how it operates on so many different levels. And I think you've addressed many of these issues already in your presentations. Oral history fills in the gaps of the historical records. It provides a fuller, more accurate picture of the past by adding information to written records, data, photographs, maps, diaries, and other historical materials. Eyewitnesses to events contribute various viewpoints and perspectives that fill in the gaps in documented history, sometimes correcting and even contradicting the written record. And also a very important aspect of oral history is its engagement, again mentioned before, where the interviewers are able to ask questions that are left out of records and interview people whose stories have been untold or forgotten. Oral history also helps us understand how individuals and communities experience the forces of history. Traditional courses, as we know, in schools only touch on the major events of the past, while oral history brings depth to our understanding of the past by carrying us into experience at an individual level, revealing the ways that decisions made by political leaders and governments change the lives of ordinary people, their families and communities. And also, very important and integral to oral history is that it preserves a sound portrait of who we are in the present and what we remember about the past for the future. So oral history enables people to share their stories in their own words, with their own voices, and through their own understanding of what happened and why. And by complicating the story with individual experience, oral historians help future historians avoid sweeping generalizations that engender stereotypes and prejudice. And finally, oral history gives voice to ordinary lives and allows history to be seen and heard from the bottom up. In this way, oral history is more quote-unquote democratic, representative, and oral history recordings help listeners better understand how individuals from different backgrounds and various viewpoints and different social strata encountered the full range of life in their day, from everyday routines to catastrophic events. So clearly oral history is more than a practice. It's an approach, an engagement, a relationship, a dialogue, an exchange, an experience, and so much more, as we've heard. So an example of an oral history project that I've worked on in the past few years, which touched on all the above points, is the Ras Beirut Oral History Project. To those of you that don't know Ras Beirut is where we are right now, the westernmost neighborhood of the city of Beirut, and of course the location of AUB. It's possessed historically a very strong historical and place identity that is associated with tolerance, multi-sectarianism, and education. And the stories that people remember about Ras Beirut before the Lebanese Civil War, before 1975, describe it as a place set apart from other parts of the city, the country, and the region. And to many, Ras Beirut is associated with the ideal of Lebanese coexistence. And except for a few published memoirs of individuals and one film, little exists on the history of Ras Beirut. So to capture that quickly disappearing heritage of place and memory and identity with the generation that remembers it, the AUB Neighborhood Initiative, which you can see up here, sponsored the Ras Beirut Oral History Project to collect the life stories of Ras Beirut's eldest inhabitants. So with a very small budget and a very short amount of time, 9 months, I set out to interview about 60 Ras Beirutis. That was our plan from the beginning. The selection of the participants was based on personal contacts, advice of key informants, and knowledge of the neighborhood. And the criteria for participation is that interviewees had to have been born before 1943, so they would have been adults before the Lebanese Civil War. And that the pool of interviewees also would comprise a representative sample that reflected the gender, class, and sectarian diversity of Ras Beirut. So the interviews were conducted using an open-ended interview technique, particular to life histories, but we followed a rough sequence of questions under broad headings such as family personal history, life pathways, urban geography, social geography, basically to construct a history of the place of Ras Beirut. All the interviews were digitally recorded, and by the end of 9 months, I had interviewed 32 women and 33 men from a mix of backgrounds, from shopkeepers to shoe shiners, including, I don't know if you remember Abu Muhammad. He used to shine shoes outside of the main gate, but he's since passed away. To medical doctors and homemakers, representing all confessional backgrounds, including different nationalities, Armenians, Palestinians, and a few Westerners as well. And out of the 63 interviews, 21 were conducted in Arabic. And then they were loosely transcribed, not accurately, because we really were under a pressure of time. But we can talk maybe more about that, of the essence of the recording and going back to the recording instead of maybe the transcript. But as Hannah mentioned, they will hopefully come out in a book. Well, they are slated for publication next year. There's a picture of some of the interviewees. The Ras Beirut Oral History Project. We are in this together, hopefully next year. So as related to the theme of this presentation, it was in the process of conducting these interviews of Ras Beirut that I actually met Miss or Sit Amini, and I only have one picture of her here on the left, which is taken when she was a much older woman. And in this context, oral history really uncovered, or actually recovered, the role of Sit Amini and her school in Ras Beirut. The first time I heard of Sit Amini and her school was in an interview with Saad Dabbous and his wife Awatif Sidani. Awatif was recalling her childhood memories of her Ras Beirut home and her garden that was dominated by the most famous date palm in the neighborhood. And she made sure, and this is the context that how Amini came up in the conversation, that the dates from this tree were set aside every year for Sit Amini, so that she would always be on her good side as a student. So I didn't really take that much notice of the reference to Ms. Amini until I recognized that the name kept coming up over and over again in subsequent interviews. And in fact, out of the 60 plus people that I interviewed, 10 of them had attended her school. And of course, a greater number of them knew of her. So those who would have attended her school in the 1930s and 1940s were born in the 1920s and the 1930s, and today are in their 80s and some are in their 90s, who were among some of the eldest interviewed. And again, this is a perfect example of how oral history restores people and places to the historical record, and this is especially the case with women, who are less likely than men to leave behind a paper trail and much less write a memoir, at least in the early 20th century. So after having learned of this Sit Amini, I went to the archives to try to find any records I could find about her. The oral history interviews remembered her as the teacher, the schoolmistress, but as children they had no idea and really could have cared less about her origins, her place of birth, and the history of her school. And again, this is a characteristic particular to oral history, that it's really not the facts that are so much remembered as much as the meanings and the associations and the experience, which to the interviewees is much more important than the facts. So I'm going to be sharing with you what I learned about this woman through piecing together the puzzle of the written records that provide us with some basic information, along with the oral histories that give us the lively recollections and impressions of her. So the first thing I learned about Sit Amini is that her full name was Amini Khouri Maktasi, and she was the sister of Jiryos Maktasi and Anis Maktasi, who were well-known residents of Ras Beirut. Both were associated with AUB, both had big families with many descendants, and both wrote memoirs about their lives. And in their memoirs, they mentioned, they made references to their sister Amini. So according to her older brother, Amini was born in Ammar al-Husn, north of Tripoli in 1876. She was the fourth child of Ilyas and Maryam al-Khouri Maktasi, who had recently converted to Protestantism, so Protestantism is very much a part of their identity. In 1879, the family moved to Tripoli, where Amini and her sisters attended the American Girls' School. She may have graduated from high school in the mid-1890s, though Anis, the younger brother, notes that she graduated in 1906. After her high school degree that was described as being equivalent to a PhD in those days for women, she taught in Tripoli and also in Egypt. And the memoir of the daughter of Jiryos Maktasi, whose name you may be familiar with, Wadad Maktasi Kurtas, who was the director of Al-Ahliya School in Beirut, writes of her aunt Amini as being, quote, among the first Lebanese women to go to Egypt. So one can safely assume that Amini moved to Ras Beirut after she returned from Egypt and after her brothers Jiryos and Anis settled there to work at AUB. So then an oral history that I conducted with the daughter of Anis Maktasi, Nida Maktasi Ma'louf, relates the colorful story passed down through the family of Amini's departure from Tripoli. Apparently, as Amini boarded the ship to Beirut, Amini's family gathered at the docks to bid her farewell, quote, as if she was going to the United States, unquote. The journey to Beirut took an overnight, and it was on that trip that a British officer allegedly asked her to dance, and to whom she was said to respond with indignation, quote, dance? But I'm a Protestant, unquote. Another account relates that Amini rejected a marriage proposal because her suitor belonged to a different denomination. All this is to say that she never married and was remembered, quote, as a Protestant from the top of her head to the soles of her feet. So the earliest written record I found mentioning Amini's name is actually from the records of the National Evangelical Church, to note that she organized the church's first Sunday school program in April of 1919. Then at the archives of the Near East School of Theology, which is up the street on Surati Street, are a series of outgoing letters. So I was looking for her name, from the treasurer of the American Mission in Beirut, here Paul Erdman, to Amini Khouri, as she was known, Amini Khouri or Miss Khouri, which is a very common name, as you know, so it was hard to pin down. And then these letters indicate that she received an annual sum of $900 from the American Mission, with $300 went to rent, and that the school was referred to as the Ras Beirut School. Also that an advisory committee oversaw the school, and Amini received a salary. And then the most recent document I found, titled the Ras Beirut School Report 1924-1925, reveals that Amini did not found the school, as many of the people I interviewed assumed that it was her school, but that the Ras Beirut School was actually led by a certain Mrs. Yasamin Hashem, which is up there, if you can make it out, who had run the school for 25 years. So we can assume if this is 1925, she'd been running the school since 1900. And this is yet another woman buried in the past, beyond the reach even of oral histories. So it just gives you an idea of, I think there's so many stories still to be found. In this report, the school was described as a preparatory school. You know, I had this idea that it was just a neighborhood school for the ASG, which is the American School for Girls in downtown Beirut, which was a very well-known school, and that for the past 2 years, the Ras Beirut School graduates were exempt from the ASG entrance exam. So high was the reputation of its students. The description continues, quote, this is in the letter here, there are a large number of Muslim girls scholars at the school, therefore only small boys have been allowed to attend. Although the school is primarily for teaching Arabic, Turkish was taught during the war, I assume that World War I obviously, even the national song, and since then, English and French. It is surprising the ease with which these small children recite first in one language and then in another, unquote. Regarding the future plans on the second page, it is reported that the American mission secured the services of a competent person to succeed Mrs. Hashim. And then we learn about this Miss Khouri, in other words, Sit Amini, had turned down an offer in Baghdad with a high salary, an offer in Damascus, and 2 other offers nearer at hand. She accepted the offer of the mission, as the quote here says, to lead this preparatory school because it presented her with the opportunity to help the mission and to serve her people. And she was willing to give up her literary work in editing a magazine if it interfered with her duties, unquote. So what's clear from this letter is that Sit Amini was really an accomplished professional and probably not the first nor the last that has disappeared from the official record or historical narrative. Furthermore, even though all those interviewed referred to the school as Sit Amini School, on paper the school was actually called the American School for Girls in Ras Beirut, Madrasat للبنات الأمريكية في راس بيروت. Even Raja Ilia, who gave me this report card that he had kept, when I interviewed him, was astonished when he pulled it out of his back room to read that the name of the school was Madrasat للبنات الأمريكية في راس بيروت. He always assumed it was, well, it's Sit Amini School. So clearly it was, the school was a formal branch of the Anglo-American Missionary School Network, and these few reports, letters, and report cards comprise this very scanty paper trail of Sit Amini and her school, which probably would not have received much notice if not for the oral histories that pulled them together. And that's the outpouring of recollections from her former students brought forth through oral history that Sit Amini and her school come to life. Indeed, Amini's austerity, her discipline, and her dedication to education still inspire a combination of admiration and fear among those who remember her. As one former student put it, she was very strict and, quote-unquote, "ma fi mazah maha." There's no messing around with her. According to the oral history interviews, the school was located on at the heart of Ras Beirut on Mektasi Street between Jeanne d'Arc and Sadat Streets. It's in this red triangle down at the bottom here. The building is remembered as a 2-story structure. On the first floor was the school with a playground in the back garden. And the back wall of the playground, you can see on Hamra Street, there's a building right next to it, was the Dumet Dairy. And apparently that was the first dairy factory in Lebanon to actually pasteurize milk. The reason why Dumet Dairy came up in the conversation is that Sit Amini's students would fondly recall that during their break at recess, they would climb the wall and yell out their orders for chocolate milk from the playgrounds. Amini lived on the 2nd floor of the building and with her mother Maryam. And today where the school stood is actually where the Co-op supermarket is, across from Marble Street Tower, Marble Tower Hotel. And I don't unfortunately have pictures of the school, but that's an image of Ras Beirut in the 1920s. And here's a couple of images of Ras Beirut in the 1930s and 1940s, just to give you an idea of how the urban scape was then. Raja Elia, going back to him, attended Sit Amini School for most of his elementary years from 1932 to 1938, after which he continued at IC, or the International College. At Amini School, his report cards list his courses of the Bible, Arabic, English, French, penmanship in those 3 languages, math, history, handiwork, drawing, music, physical education, cleanliness, orderliness, diligence, and conduct. As was typical in many of these Western-based schools, students were forbidden at that time to speak Arabic during recess. And if they were caught, they would receive a small wooden counter called the signal, and they would have to keep it until somebody else spoke Arabic. And if you got the signal more than once, you would suffer Amini's wrath, and as some recalled, have to write on the board, quote, "I will not speak Arabic again during recess," 100 times. Raja Ilia remembers being scared of her all the time. Amini was so strict that if a child misbehaved, he or she was kept at school instead of going home for lunch. So when Raja Elia's elder brother, Nami, did not come home on one occasion, his father went to the school to ask his whereabouts, and Amini explained Nami's punishment and told his father that if he took Nami home during lunch, you don't come back to school. So in response, Elia's father moved all of his sons to IC until Nami graduated, after which Raja moved back to Amini's school for his last 2 years. Another student, Najwa Shaheen, recalls her strategy for dealing with her fear of Amini was, quote, to imagine her with her glasses and a tight white bun riding a bicycle. Another student recalls that when he was on a prolonged family visit to Ras Beirut, he and his cousin fibbed about their age. Oh gosh, I have to hurry. So they could be together in the same class. When Miss Amini visited the student's mother and discovered his actual age, thus catching the boy's lie, he recalled, my God, that was the first crisis in my life. Amini School definitely was a place to perform a localized Ras Beirut Protestantism, even when it included non-Protestants. The school day began around the piano with hymns and prayers. Amini read the daily prayer, and her sister Esther played the piano. But the students represented all religious backgrounds, mostly Protestant, Greek Orthodox, some Sunni and Druze children. Munir Shamma recalled wondering about the Immaculate Conception, but never understood what it meant until he reached puberty. Muna Damlouji remembers that her Muslim classmate Fatima Al-Aitani ranked first in the Bible class. And I'll just jump ahead here to the choir that came out of the Miss Amini School. This is the Ras Beirut choir that was organized by Sami Salibi, who's in the middle of the photograph. And this photograph was given to me by Najwa Shaheen during my interview with her. And it shows all of the, well, it shows the Raja Iliya up on the upper right side, Najwa Shaheen on the lower right, and Raja Barudi also to the right of Sami Salibi, who's in the middle. So, again, giving you a sense of these people that have grown up and, were impacted by Miss Amini's school. Sami Salibi then went on to establish the Ras Beirut Center for Music that became another Ras Beirut landmark for the musically inclined. So for all her sternness, Miss Amini was a role model for many of her former students, and especially her niece, Wadad Maktasi Kortas, who later, again, headed Ahliya School. Wadad kept her aunt's example close at heart. In her own memoir, she recounts the story of Amini. On a visit to a mosque with her brother and a group of his all-male friends, as Amini was about to ascend the minaret, the attendant stopped her and told her she couldn't climb up because, quote, God gave you half a brain and made you inherit half a man's share, unquote. She brushed past him and replied, quote, God gave me a full brain and it's men like you who gave me half the inheritance, unquote. Sit Amini retired in 1948, died in 1959 at the age of 83. After her retirement, another woman, Rida Juraydini, took charge of the school and moved it a few blocks northeast, where it became informally known as Miss Juraydini School, and today is the National Protestant College, which still exists. But yet, Miss Amini is still remembered today as an institution among those in their 80s and their 90s. And Raja Barudi suggested that they should erect a statue of her in front of the Co-op supermarket to permanently commemorate her, and that she should be depicted in action pulling at the ear of a student. Not the best image, but anyway. So all but absent from the historical record, this quote-unquote best school in the world clearly left an indelible mark on the formative identity and memory of a number of Ras Beirut's inhabitants. The power of oral history to capture the memory of Amini gives the untold local histories of everyday lived lives a multivocality that makes tangible the rich texture of local history. Indeed, oral history taps the reserves of memory of everyday life, simply unavailable or overlooked in the written historical record. And in this case, the dispersed, scanty paper trails brought together and made meaningful by oral history. I'm sure there's so many other histories waiting to be recovered and recorded through oral history with an eye towards establishing a much more inclusive and representative history from now on, I hope. Thank you. Thank you.
Now we move to Monica Basbous, who's an architect and an urban researcher. Her focuses have included questions on urban mobility, informal spatial practices, and politics of representations of space. Her media include writing, mapping, illustration, and web design. She has taken part in different educational platforms through panels, seminars, and workshops, and has taught architectural design at the Lebanese American University. Monica has been part of Public Works Studios since 2017.
Okay. Hello. So I'm here today on behalf of Public Works, who are a multidisciplinary research and design studio who engage critically and creatively with urban and public issues in Beirut. So I will share with you today two main projects whose methodologies and findings resonate the most with the themes that were addressed today. And while the starting points of these projects were not centered around gender or identity-based, I will try to present some observations and questions that attempt a modest gendered reading of some of our findings and possible sites for future exploration. So the two projects have this in common, that they both engage with and give space to practices and stories that challenge a polarized public discourse. But also they're practices and stories that are often disregarded and that constitute forms of resistance to market pressures, unjust planning, and institutional neglect. So in mapping Beirut from its tenants' stories, we encountered situations that defied the mainstream narrative around the housing crisis. As it is furthered by the media, by public officials, and by the public opinion in general, the discourse pits against each other the tenants and owners as two homogeneous, mutually exclusive, and irreconcilable blocks. Not only is this generalization inaccurate and simplistic, it's also dangerous because it displaces a fundamentally structural problem and crisis onto individuals. So it transforms a crisis that needs to be addressed by the state and by the law into a social crisis. So in the research, we came across a lot of complex and multiple profiles and concerns of both tenants and owners that clearly challenge the public opinion on this matter and the tenant-owner dichotomy. So the second project I will share today is called Planning the City Through Play. And it looks at an array of informal soccer fields in the city. These fields consist of mostly privately owned, unbuilt plots of land. But despite the status of their ownership, these sites have been used and maintained and sustained by communities of youth for several years and sometimes even decades. And while some of them have gradually been privatized, fenced off, or built, others have found tactics and loopholes to survive despite the multiple pressures on them. These practices parallel the collective practices of 1940s pre-modern Beirut, where walking, picnics, and other temporary recreational uses took place in open, unprogrammed lands, regardless of their ownership status. So this is another project by Public Works that I will not go into today, but just briefly, many privately owned natural sites were spontaneously and informally used and appropriated before the modern separation between private and public as two rigid categories was introduced to this context. So in this sense, the practices around the soccer fields challenge the private-public dichotomy that feels so natural to many of us today. So I will start with mapping Beirut. So in 2014, the new draft of the rent law allowed for widespread evictions to take place both directly and indirectly in Beirut. On one hand, it proposed to incrementally increase rents, old rents, until current unregulated market prices were reached. So this measure was materially impossible for a large proportion of old tenants. On the other hand, it loosened restrictions on evictions by exempting owners from paying compensation to evicted tenants. So the housing crisis here reached a peak, and in the public opinion, the only way to see it was black or white, tenants versus owners. In response to the situation, Public Works conducted Mapping Beirut Through Its Tenants' Stories, which was a multidisciplinary research project conducted in 2015 and 2016, that studied the impact of market-driven developments on housing rights and on policies. So this was done in 6 neighborhoods of Beirut: Shiah, Badawi, Bashura, Roum, Msaytbeh, and Tariq Jdida, and most recently in Ras Beirut. So it looked at the creation of social and spatial injustices and at the resulting displacement of many families. In these neighborhoods, we investigated the modes through which residents access their housing and vest claims over their houses and their neighborhoods. And we documented potential paths towards affordable housing in the future. So this project was developed in the form of workshops where participants were given the tools to conduct fieldwork with the residents of the neighborhoods. We surveyed housing arrangements floor by floor, we mapped them, and conducted in-depth interviews with old tenants, old owners, new tenants, and new owners. The old and the new being defined by the 1992 law. We also documented cases of evictions and identified threatened households. And then these findings were disseminated in different ways that aim to produce a knowledge-based discourse on housing rights and to influence the debate around rent law and the right to the city and policies in general. So we held neighborhood meetings and exhibitions where we discussed the findings and possible strategies with the residents of the neighborhoods, like in Mar Mikhail and Tariq Jdide. We also made use of different publishing channels and organized communication campaigns. And we also organized walking tours of certain neighborhoods like Badawi, Rum, and Bashura. And we also launched projects based on this research. The Beirut Evictions Monitor is one of them. The Beirut Evictions Monitor is an interactive online map that visualizes evictions in Beirut alongside eviction stories. So it's populated both by us through the research that we conducted, but it's also open to users, for users to input their own stories and struggles with housing. So what this does is that it serves both as a research tool, but also it's a political tool for organizing and for enabling data collection and accumulation. And what it does is that it offers a reading of a citywide process as opposed to isolated cases of eviction. So the particularity of the 6 neighborhoods that we studied is that they have historically provided affordable housing arrangements for different socioeconomic groups. So they often allowed rural working class people, for example, to access housing in the city to live, study, and work. And this is an important point because it reframes the housing crisis into a larger scale and time frame. And so what we're faced with today are not individual cases that are isolated, but rather a citywide process that is jeopardizing the housing security of over a quarter of Beirut's residents. And at the same time, it's considerably restricting who will have access to housing in the city in the future. So what we found was a far more complex spectrum of profiles and relationships than simply the tenants versus owners discourse. Some owners and tenants have successfully managed to negotiate new agreements that were convenient to both. Other owners' struggles are not with tenants, but with other owners. So, for example, other owners include real estate developers and entrepreneurs, for example, many of which exploited the situation by buying from old owners in the few years leading up to 2014. So they bought buildings at a cheap price with the excuse of having to pay compensation to evict the old tenants within them. But then after the new law came out, they no longer had to pay this compensation. So the situation allowed for developers to take advantage of both old owners and old tenants at the same time. Also, when looking at family-owned properties, especially inherited ones, we were able to trace cases in which old owners are equally subject to displacement due to their vulnerable position in a shared property system. So this is particularly true in neighborhoods where property owners are middle or lower income residents. For instance, the neighborhood of Mar Mikhail and Rum. Since 2007, Mar Mikhail Street has been subject to a wave of economic shifts, and over the past 10 years, we've seen the emergence of over 150 new businesses, and land prices doubled in just a few years. So since then, the area has attracted developers who buy off buildings where old tenants and old owners live, evicting both and then demolishing the building. Also, resident owners, so owners who live in the buildings where they share the property, have very little negotiating power when they're the weakest link in a shared property. And in most of the cases we traced, they are women. For example, in the red building, this red building on Khazinain Street, it has been mostly abandoned except for Munira and her family who live on the last floor. So through generational inheritance, Munira owns 200 shares out of 2,400, and 2 of her relatives own the rest. Given the existing legal setup, where small shareholders have almost no negotiating power, the 2 other owners, so her relatives, decided not to rent out the empty shops or the other apartments in the building, with the aim of selling the building to a developer, probably. So this would mean that eventually Munira would have to be displaced out of Beirut because whatever compensation she would get would not be enough for her to rent or buy within the neighborhood or the city. This takes us to another example, which is on Mar Mikhail Street, where 6 families used to live. After the death of the initial landowner, the land was distributed onto 11 inheritors, 2 of which live in this building, Madame Hayat and Georgette. In 2011, a real estate company purchased the shares of the owners who do not live on the property and evicted gradually the 4 old tenants and the 2 shareholder owners. All of them were displaced out of Beirut. As for the tenants, the larger proportion of them today are elderly people, usually retired and with no substantial income, unable to afford the increases in rent since 2014, unable to take out loans, which is the only form of state-led housing policy today, unless they have children who can do so on their behalf, which is also a problem. And rarely do their eviction compensations allow them to remain in the city after they've been evicted, and which is where they spent most of their lives. So in these cases, evictions don't only constitute the loss of a dwelling, they also constitute a form of psychological and emotional violence, uprooting people from the surroundings where they spent most of their lives and where they've built their social networks and their support systems. So this is clear in the case of Jumana from Tariq Jdide. Jumana and her family of 7 were forced to leave their historical home and move to an area outside of Beirut where they have no ties except for the new house they live in, after the old building they used to live in was sold off and demolished. So Jumana's family was not the only one affected by the situation. The other tenants in the building were also evicted and had to leave the neighborhood and Beirut because the compensations were so low. So the family had bought a house in Barja 10 years ago, but kept offering it up for sale several times out of reluctance. Realizing that they would not be able to remain in Beirut, they eventually obtained a loan from the bank to equip the house and make it habitable. But their remoteness from the place where they grew up, their neighbors, the traditions that they knew, and all of this, generated what they described as a sense of alienation, an alienation that they were not able to cope with. And so after a year of living in Barja, Jumana decided to leave her family and return to Beirut, where she rented a room in an apartment that she shares with other girls. The decision to share accommodation was very difficult for her in the beginning, but it was the simplest and the least expensive option. Jumana's entire family experienced the situation of tension and confusion, especially her mother, who was lonely and found it difficult to integrate and engage with her new surroundings after having left the neighborhood. And her health deteriorated and she was hospitalized several times since. Unfortunately, Jumana's case is far from exceptional, as all her neighbors equally had to move to areas like Jiye, Jadra, and Siblin. And these and other cases indicate that middle and lower income residents are those most at risk of displacement, whether they are tenants or owners. What's also starting to become clear is that female property owners often happen to be minor shareholders in properties, which puts them in a clear situation of instability and disadvantage with regards to their agency over their housing situations. We can also ask how this housing crisis is reinforcing certain class and gender practices, such as leaving or staying in the familial home, or sharing sometimes overcrowded dorms or rooms, and how this in turn impacts livelihoods and well-being. The second project I will share today is called Planning the City Through Play, Youth Efforts in Making Communal Football Fields in Beirut. So this project gathers the stories and histories of places produced and sustained by the efforts of youth in the city. Growing up in urban neighborhoods is largely shaped by appropriating derelict spaces, empty spaces for play. So in Beirut, low-income residents have managed to transform these spaces into soccer fields where the community gathers to play and interact in what has imaginatively turned into a public space. However, over time and with the rapid densification and privatization of the city, this has made these communal spaces gradually disappear. So what we see here in red on the map are all the informal fields that no longer exist, and in green are the ones that were part of this research. So acquiring spaces to play becomes a daily exercise of resistance. Youths commit numerous acts of transgression, like climbing over fences, disrupting construction sites, tagging on walls, and tracing on the ground to claim these spaces. These actions invite us to see urban spaces through the lens of playful practices, defying our conception of private property and the public domain. In this project, we documented these places through fieldwork, so through interviews, go-alongs, observation, and analysis of aerial photography, historical aerial photography. So we outlined the trajectories of these fields, which allowed us to map the spatial transformations and the confrontations between the youth and the property owners. So here we see on the top the field of Karantina that emerged in 1994 after the return of residents once the war was over. In 2014, a telecom pole was installed in the middle of the field, disrupting play. And after several complaints were raised by the residents regarding their safety, the pole was finally moved to another location and playing resumed until today. Then we have Hirsh Atil running since 1984, which was reduced in size but still runs today. Then we have Tariq Jdide running since 1994, that was also disrupted by a telecom pole in the middle of the field. But then when the ownership of the land changed, the field was walled off, and there's actually a funny story that residents tell today about the wall, which is that for every row of bricks that construction workers laid during the day, the players would come at night and undo two. So this kept on for weeks until the players finally gave up, and the access was closed. And today it is discreetly accessed, but it's in no shape to play, so to allow for soccer to be played on it. We have Jnah, two fields, one since 1980, the other since 2005. Watam Saidbe since 1994. Bashura since 1972. Ras Al Naba since 2005, and that actually made the news in 2012 when players resisted the transformation of the lot into a parking lot by persistently throwing glass bottles at the cars. And eventually they managed to reclaim the space. They broke the lock, took the field again, and used the guardhouse to put their uniforms. And eventually they destroyed the guardhouse and extended the field to have a second smaller one. And finally, Marlies running since 97 until today, but shrunk in size also due to lack of maintenance. So we documented these fields according to different elements that make them up, sometimes temporary, often improvised, set up by the youth that use them. So makeshift stairs, stepping stones, chalk, spray paint, spare tires, everything goes in the making of the field. So here's a little matrix of means used to allow access and to appropriate the field into, to be able to play soccer in it, basically. Okay, so the large majority of the teams that we saw make use of these spaces consist of young males. This could be explained by the different levels of transgression required to access these spaces, like climbing on the walls, sneaking through fences, tagging walls, setting up the field, improvising changing rooms in open spaces, or by the predominantly male presence within them, whether physical or through the markings on the walls. So Karantina here is actually an exception, where we actually see young female people like they engage with the field, but kind of indirectly through the elements that are there, but they don't organize into teams or play soccer. But in Marlies, for example, which is the bottom right image here, we actually found that young girls do enjoy playing soccer, but they don't do so in the informal field because of social stigma and social pressures around them. So instead, they do it in alleyways and on rooftops, which they use to play soccer, but also other games. So further investigation would be needed to look into the spaces that are appropriated by young females to carry out shared practices of play. So this project was published in different places, and we're currently conducting a workshop with the youth from Marlies to produce a zine and a podcast that tells their stories of play in the camp. That's it. Thank you.
Last but not least, مشهد. ختامها مسك مع سارة مراد. Sarah is an assistant professor in the Media Studies program and the coordinator of the Women and Gender Studies Initiative at AUB. She works at the intersection of media studies, feminist theory, postcolonial theory, and queer studies. Her current research explores the role of media in the formation and expression of sexual subcultures and identities in post-war Lebanon. تفضلي سارة.
So I'm not going to talk about practices of archiving or oral history. I'm going to speak from the other side, the side of the consumer of what I consider to be a feminist archive. And so looking at what it can do and how we can engage with it. So how can we read a text to make it into some sort of feminist archive or feminist text? And I will be engaging with one essay in specific by Lebanese-American poet, painter, and writer Etel Adnan. And I will be thinking through what Adnan's text has allowed me to think about. And so this is a very personal reflection. Like many of my intellectual pursuits, I came to Etel Adnan by coincidence. I stumbled upon her essay titled Growing Up to Be a Woman Writer in Lebanon when I was finishing my PhD dissertation in Philadelphia. I had been living and studying in the US for 5 years, and now I'm back in Should I go on? Yeah? مش مشكلة. Okay. So I stumbled upon Adnan's essay Growing Up to Be a Woman Writer in Lebanon when I was finishing my PhD dissertation in Philadelphia. I had been living and studying in the US for 5 years, and my physical and psychic distance from Beirut had obviously increased over time. I had been writing about sexual politics in Lebanon, but had grown distant from my own memories of life there, from politics and everyday life and the general sense of inhabiting a city like Beirut. But more specifically, because of my own studies, I was knee-deep into feminist literature and feminist scholarship. And the two main fields that I was engaged with at the time was post-colonial theory, specifically post-colonial theories of gender and sexuality in the Middle East. And then, on the other hand, feminist theory from the second wave of the women's liberation movement in the US. So I was interested in looking at the emergence of a feminist counterpublic in the US in the late 60s and 70s. So these were the two feminist literatures on feminism that I was engaged with. And what I found to be lacking or missing, and because I was reading them both at the same time, what I found lacking in the Middle Eastern and Arab literature at the time, and obviously I'm speaking about scholarship in English here. was the lack of the personal, of the I in these accounts, and the distance basically between the writer herself and the context that she's writing about, which is what actually drew me to the other literature, the second wave feminist literature, which really, one of its main features was placing the author, the female author, through her personal history, through her personal experience, trying to create theory from the deeply personal experiences of the author. So that's what drew me to that literature. And this is when I came across Adnan's text and what drew me to it. And at the time, I would be regularly Skyping with my mother before WhatsApp came to be. And I remember how hearing the sound of the evening news in the background as I was speaking to her gave me a comforting sense of familiarity, but also of alienation of not being where she was, from my home, from feeling that distance from what was happening there, from the sense of urgency and everydayness there. And so it was perhaps, and I'm bringing up my mother here because it was perhaps Adnan's mother in the text and her relationship to her mother that drew me first to it. And this is what I will be speaking about today. And specifically the relationship to her mother, or how the relationship to her mother mediated her relationship to both language but also to exile. And this sort of triangle as a way for me to think about this as a companion text for me, a feminist companion text for me. Because specifically she's talking about what it meant to become a woman writer in that particular space in a particular time. Adnan's mother appears as a paranoid figure, policing her daughter's behavior and embodying for Adnan a whole culture's scrutiny that she was trying to free herself from. And we're talking here about 1930s Beirut. She stands in the way of her daughter's intellectual aspirations and her ambitions, and as she feels her slip between her fingers towards a universe unknown to her. This universe was French, first manifesting itself in the French nuns of the French Catholic Church, the custodians of the Mission Civilisatrice in 1930s Lebanon, which sought to uplift indigenous populations through the spread and promotion of the French language. And so Adnan was a pupil there in the French school. Upon establishing their official mandate over Syria and Lebanon, the French expanded the already existing school system in the country and added to the existing schools new ones. And so they imposed a system of education in total conformity with its counterpart in France. An education, Adnan notes, and I'm quoting here, that had nothing to do with the history and the geography of the children involved. Reflecting on her language education during these formative years, Adnan remembers how she started speaking French upon starting school at age 5, and then only French, and it resonates with what you were saying, as Arabic was forbidden in these schools. So, Adnan writes, quote, "I grew up thinking that the world was French, and that everything that mattered, that was in books or had authority, the nuns, did not concern our environment. This is what is called alienation." I was also schooled in French, but in an American institution, the International College that you also mentioned. I also attended Madame Jreidine.
Okay.
In my childhood, I wrote poems and short stories in Arabic. As I grew older, and upon the addition of English to our curriculum in middle school, I gradually started shifting to English. It appeared to me as a simpler, more manageable language. And it was increasingly becoming the language of the culture I consumed every day. I was seduced by its simplicity, and as a teenager, I took it up as my primary language of self-expression. It was the language of my love letters and my personal reflections, so my own thoughts scribbled down. When I started college at the American University of Beirut, an American missionary institution, Arabic and French gradually faded. English became the language of my intellect. Like Adnan, I found immense pleasure in mastering a new language, acquiring a whole new vocabulary. And I wonder, and this is again the appeal of that text, this relationship between acquiring a language as an alienation from the maternal space, as a rupture of the maternal bond. And I wondered about this sort of dynamic with my own mother. And I wondered whether she felt me slipping towards another place. I am not sure. But my mother saw me drift from what is familiar to her, and when the time came to leave, for me to leave to the US, to make that decision to continue my studies abroad, she let go without any struggle. As Adnan started expressing her desire to move to France to continue her education, Paris came to embody, for her mother, quote, hell itself, the capital of white female slavery, the chaos in which children who have left home disappear forever, end quote. And when she finally told her mother that her professor at the École des Lettres wanted to send her on a scholarship to Paris to continue her licence, because this was simply not a possibility in Lebanon, the mother accused the teacher of being an immoral man, stirring us up and separating us from our homes, and the mother threatened to blow up the school. We obviously lived in irreconcilable worlds, Adnan concludes. So studying in a language basically foreign to my parents, she writes, created a distance between us. I was engaging myself in territories alien to them, and I was being estranged. I felt more and more different, with frames of references they could not share. I was becoming a foreigner in my own house, end quote. So what's interesting here is how mastering the colonizer's language secured an education, followed by a first job as a teacher of French literature in Al Ahliya School for Girls, where she actually met Huda Cortas, whom she admired immensely, and Huda Cortas embodied for her, before she had left to continue her studies, the way she describes her is the woman who went to AUB and then eventually got her PhD in education from the US and returned to Lebanon. So that was another important female figure that appears in the text. And here, just to point out, and this is something that's been mentioned in the morning panel today, how when we read women's autobiographies, women's stories, we're not just learning about them, but we're learning about a whole constellation of sites and spaces and dynamics and people that emerge in their texts. So to me, it's the other female figures that appear alongside Adnan, and the way she narrates her relationships to them. So whether it's the headmistress of Al Ahliya or whether it's the mother, this is what what drew me to this, and again, what made me appreciate how she was able to narrate a colonial history, because to me, having read about this, colonial history and how it has shaped gender dynamics and the relationship between colonial education and women's emancipation, I had read about it in a very particular way. So reading that text as a colonial, as a text that belongs in the colonial archive, and coming from a woman who is acknowledging her struggle with language and her movement between languages, as a post-colonial dilemma that really mirrored my own. And this is something that was not necessarily available to me in other texts, because the other emotions that would, would be stirred were maybe a sense of guilt, perhaps. Why not write in Arabic? Why not speak in Arabic? Which is a sense of guilt I carry with me, but it was important to me to think about it differently. And so it is a colonial text for me, but it's also a feminist text for me. And it's doing both things simultaneously. So mastering the colonizer's language secured an education, followed by a job in Al Ahliya School, and eventually a scholarship to study philosophy at the Sorbonne in 1949. A little girl, Adnan writes, was a daughter, a schoolgirl, and a future wife. She was never considered as an autonomous being whose life could turn out to be something other than what was considered to be the social norm. These norms dictated marriage as the ultimate destiny of young women. So the daughter's budding desire to become an engineer at first, and her later quest to get a university degree in literature, were deemed to be immoral by her mother. And when she professed her disinterest in getting married, she was accused of, quote, preferring to be adventurous and irresponsible, and was often made to understand that she was in danger of losing her mind. So this essay brings out familiar tropes around insubordinate women: immorality, narcissism, mental illness. But more than that, the essay is about an undutiful daughter whose path had deviated from all that was familiar by way of writing, of mastering a language. To grow up a woman writer in Lebanon for Adnan is to feel alienated from the familiar. Learning French ruptured the maternal bond, marking a decisive moment of emancipation from maternal authority. But it would be a mistake to cast Adnan's mother as the obstacle she had to overcome. We learn from the text that the Greek Orthodox woman was shunned by her family for marrying a Muslim Syrian man. So Adnan comes from a mixed religious background. She too was estranged from her world, from what was familiar, and bore the cost of her choices. She too, in her way, was an undutiful daughter, not abiding by the norms of her time. So in a way, her insubordination, or Adnan's insubordination, also has an archive and a history of its own that appears to us that we can read in the text itself and sort of unearth. In addition, and this is something, again, that she talks about in the essay, Adnan's sort of identification, or her refusal to identify along the lines of, masculinity or femininity. And she says, being dressed as a boy made me feel very happy. And then she recalls the first time this sort of happiness she felt by being dressed as a boy. She recalls a pair of short black pantaloons and a white satin blouse sewn by her mother. She notes that the outfit must have reinforced her identity of being neither just a girl nor a boy, but a special being with the magical attributes of both. So here again, we see the labor, the motherly labor of Adnan's mother, who remains unnamed, again appear in the text. So to go back to this notion of agency, even though at first sight we may see this woman as someone who's standing in the way of her daughter, we also see, and this constant back and forth between the daughter and the mother, we also see that her own choices and her labor have opened up sites of agency for unexpected sites of agency for her daughter that she could not have imagined. And so I want to end with a note on why this discussion of the text, why think of it as an archive. And to me, it's, because of the work it has done to me, allowed me to think of, as I mentioned, the experience of being a post-colonial subject, written from the point of view of a woman who lived in Beirut in the 1930s, in the 1940s. It was a narrative that was previously not necessarily available to me. Of a woman writing about her emancipation as a woman by way of writing. So a lot of resonance there. But also of a woman talking about her relationship with her mother. And so to me, writing the feminist archive must also necessarily include a grappling with mother-daughter relationships and an archiving of these relationships. And so thinking about this question of womanhood, of agency, of emancipation, rather than only focusing on or trying to paint it as a sort of struggle with men or struggle with the patriarchy. Also, and this is work that's already being done, obviously, but also highlighting women's relationships and the maybe earliest attempts at emancipation and this negotiation of freedom that a woman has to do with her own mother. And this, importantly, is not just about motherhood, but also about this generational discussion that's emerged several times today in the discussion. So thinking about women who came before us, thinking about previous generations of feminists, thinking about what counts as a feminist act, even when we don't necessarily decide to describe it or name it as such. And I think in that personal history, we can find a lot to grapple with. So, yes, I will end here. Thank you.
In the following in Zena's footsteps, I will ask one question each and then open that up to the floor. There's a question that's to both Maria and Monica. On the one hand, there's the reconstructing of stories. So there's the reconstruction of stories through spatial memory, and there's the reconstruction of space through oral histories. To Monica, it's interesting how mapping is one form of building a history and an archive, and reading it through a gendered lens. Do you see public works, different maps and stories and documentation as an archive of Beirut and its residents? And is there a direction to treat it as such and open it up one day? And to Maria, sorry. I've seen you give other parts of this project, and there's always an element of reconstructing Ras Beirut through oral history. So even though it is not the intention, once you said someone's house was the dairy section of Idris. Exactly. So how do we see these two practices of mapping and oral histories coming together? And for Sarah, you picked up on the theme that's been in discussion all day, is that we need to excavate women out of the archives. It's not a task that is readily available. You need to go through hoops and loops. And the poem or the essay or the novel is one form of that. So could you say more about the literary text as archive, but also is it true that Tel Adnan decided to stop writing in French with the Algerian Revolution, and how does that then reflect back? If learning French is to break the maternal bond, and then quitting French is an anti-colonial stance, but you also quit writing altogether when she quit writing in French. So can you reflect on that? Thank you.
So where should we start?
Yeah.
Monica? Okay, so your question about how do mapping and oral history come together. Okay. I think one of the most interesting aspects of listening to oral histories is actually listening to how people are constructing space as they talk. So what is called mental mapping. It's almost as if, they want to pull out, many of them wanted to pull out a piece of paper and just start drawing, what they're talking about. Like this was here and this was there, or if they were talking about the seacoast, these are all the parts of the seacoast that had specific names. So I think mapping is integral to oral history because I think we think as we're imagining our stories, our past, we think in spatial terms. We think a narrative follows a trajectory, and I think that trajectory is integral, or space is integral to that trajectory. So I think the two are very closely intertwined. I can't imagine not talking about place or space when you're talking about your stories. So I think they're not one and the same, but they are completely complementary. Yep. One can't exist without the other, I think. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. Yeah.
So if the question was whether mapping was actually a form of archiving, okay. I think that it is, but we take, I think, mapping in a larger sense, as in not just the production of maps, but rather an approach of how to delineate and read space. So, as Maria was saying, maps are complementary to other forms of accounts of space and of trajectories within that space, whether it's housing or public space or other kinds of space. But about the access to these archives, most of what we produce is actually openly accessible, but we try to curate what wouldn't cause any kind of threat sometime down the line, because when we're talking about threatened informal fields or tenants threatened with eviction or things like that, access to this kind of information can become a bit sensitive sometimes, and so I think we need to take some precautions with what we share and how. Although ideally it would be open source, open access. Yeah. So yeah, I think does that answer the question? Yeah.
So I'll start with the second question on language. So after she lived in France, she moved to the United States, and she spent most of the, she's been in between France and the US. I believe now she's in France. She's moved to France, but she lived in California for a long time. And her movement to the US coincided with the Vietnam War. And the beginnings of the also civil rights movements and political activism at the time. Her shift from French to English happened during the Algerian War. And to her, it was a political choice she had to make. She could not tolerate writing in the language of the colonizer anymore, as she saw the Algerian War unfolding. So she decided to switch to English. And it was also a move that, this is when she started writing poetry. So her poetry is primarily in English. So if you look at the archive of Atal Adnan today, it is a multilingual archive. And I would argue that she is a writer with no mother tongue, really, because her mother spoke to her in Greek and Turkish. Her father spoke to her in Arabic. She learned French in school. Then she ended up, moving to English. And then ultimately she gave up writing and started painting, because to her painting was the only way where she could transcend language altogether. So saying that art has no language. So language was so central to her her prose, her poetry. She would write about language. She would write about her struggles with language. And that's why I think her work could be mined as a sort of an archive of what Ray Chow, and Ray Chow is a film scholar, a post-colonial scholar, has called the post-colonial scene of languaging. So languaging as a post-colonial experience, and how do we make sense of it? And I think that for Adnan, language was a prosthetic. We can think of it as a, she used it maybe in different ways and meant it to meet what she, to get to where she wanted to go. Yeah.
Zena? First of all, I'd like to start by saying
your paper was very moving on so many levels. And I could read to it so many, actually, contributions, not only to feminist theory, but also to literary criticism. I mean, it's working on so many levels. My question to you is this: to what extent do you read the original text of Adnan as both a post-colonial text, but also a contemporary critique of post-colonial theory? And I was wondering if you'd comment on that. And my question to you, Maria, I could see in the narrative of Sid and Nina a valuable excavation into a story that has been sidelined. But if you put it in the wider narrative of the history of Ras Beirut, the history of the Syrian Protestant College in the UB, I see it as a very dominant narrative, dominant of the Protestant educator. So to what extent is this process of excavation reproducing power dynamics that have never left the narrative that has informed Ras Beirut? So to what extent are we also contributing to the making of the story of a very powerful woman who belonged to a powerful class of educators in Ras Beirut? So I'm just wondering if you can comment on that.
No, I don't think so.
I thought you raised your hand. I didn't have the horse first.
It's fine. You can ask them. No. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about, the idea of language, basically, also that Professor Sala talked about. And, disclosing, all these forms of sexuality, of being in the closet, of developing something between myself and the world, which is, of course, obviously also was developing in parallel or before the French feminist wave, the écriture féminine. Obviously, so writing through or becoming woman through writing, but I was wondering whether that idea also in relation to being a post-colonial subject now, right? What is the relationship between the idea of that kind of new écriture féminine or archiving it and also like using it as a form of an agential work of subversion, for example? Also, does it have, or does that idea of writing through actually in the contemporary moment need more? Or is there a new form of an operational modus operandi, that writing through or becoming other or being a post-colonial subject in a neo-capitalist and neoliberal world order demand from us? Because all these issues, of course, have been to a very, very great extent being dealt with also in an art context. If I think of Mona Hatoum, for example, and most obviously also with a lot of Arab female writers, where the relationship between the mother and the daughter is very important, kinship is very important, that bond is very important, and these things have been materialized in literature and beyond, not just in the West, but here as well. So my question is there something that needs to go beyond that, like experiential writing, right, towards something, a new form of renewal, an operational, agential form of renewal or not?
Right, thanks very much. 3 fantastic presentations, really enjoyed them, but I just focus on language because it's one of my obsessions. And so just before the session, actually, Sarah and I were talking about, there was this conference and which language do they use. And then I was and listening to you, of course, remembering the Tel Adnan story and all the many third world, if you like, writers who've talked, for whom language was always an issue, the language of the colonizer, and of course you have other African writers who decided to stop writing in English and then write in their native languages. And so the language issue continues, and it's really a struggle. And I was just wondering to what extent we can. Okay, so having said that, there's this awareness and there's this issue, but then we also try to face the idea that, I've been to other conferences. I remember, let me just share with you, I've been to this language issue so many times, so I don't know how to organize my thoughts, but I remember I attended this meeting that was organized by Fatima Narnisi in the early 90s, where the first thing she said was, okay, language is not an issue. And she said that at a time when, she said it for a reason. This was a very political and very feminist statement at the time. She thinks decisions are very contextual, right? So at that time, language is not an issue. You want to speak in French, you want to speak in English, you want to speak in Arabic, it doesn't matter. The context, of course, was an Algerian context. and the majority of the activists at the time spoke no Arabic. And this was the 90s, and this is when they were getting a lot of horrible attacks from, the Islamists, who were basically telling them you're not Algerian, you're French, and so on and so forth. So language was a huge issue, and it was big. So the starting point at the time was language is not an issue, because this was, for me, the feminist standpoint. But then, for example, for me, Women and Memory, the decision to use Arabic and to make language an issue became the feminist standpoint, but that was a very different context. And so I mentioned this because it seems to me that there's a lot to be said about language and when and how do we make decisions and why might help us all in thinking through our feminism in the Arab world. I was just sharing this with you, so thank you for bringing this up. Yeah.
Yes. So I think in terms of it being a contemporary critique, I think you've captured this that it could be taken as a critique of post-colonial theory today, and I think in most immediately the question of authenticity, monolingualism being one, manifestation of that, this attachment maybe to the authentic language of the anti-colonial subject in that regard. And I think where it becomes interesting in bridging the colonial and the female experience, or the experience of the woman in a context, in the colonial context, because the way we've addressed this intersection of gender and colonialism has been, and Huda, you've mentioned this earlier today, what is the West gonna say? We're always writing with this paranoid a disposition to anticipate how we will be critiqued by the West. And when we say the West today, we're also talking about how we will be critiqued by post-colonial scholars, judging the kind of work that we do as feminists, whether as writers or organizers or archivists. So I think the other, so where the conversation has been is how women's emancipation has been instrumentalized by Western agendas. So how they've been used as a tool to further neoliberalism, to further neo-imperial agendas, to further cultural imperialism maybe. And I think where this kind of text takes us is how women have used, in this case, the colonizer's language, how they've instrumentalized it to go somewhere else, and to go somewhere else that is not glorifying this, but rather at each step flagging the fact that, she had, in a way, she had no choice also, but she decided to do something else with it, and to do a critique of the colonizer with it. This idea of Audre Lorde, can we dismantle the master's house with the master's rule? This is the master's tools, an ongoing question, and I think she answers it in a particular way. The contextuality of the language is definitely. I don't think there's an answer, what language do you decide to speak in that works for all times and spaces. It is often a strategic choice and a political choice, and for me it is a deeply personal also conundrum that I've been struggling, the unlearning of languages, the learning of languages. Yeah, but we can talk more about this later.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think, I think looking back at that context of Ras Beirut and the Protestant character of Ras Beirut has really been something that has been created long after the fact. And if you look at the history of the Syrian Protestant College and then what be, of course, AUB, the local Arab, Syrian, Lebanese, whatever you want to call them, professors were really regarded as a kind of, the tension was more between the Anglo-American community and or faculty and the local faculty. And it really wasn't until, I think it wasn't until 1920 that Anis Makdisi became appointed a full professor, and that was 16 years after he graduated. So I don't think that it was so much a question of the domination of Protestantism or at that point in time. I think we can look back at it and see its emergence. But if you look at the history of the missionary Anglo-American missionary history, they always kind of kept a distance between themselves and the locals. And the locals were, regarded as, we have to keep them in check and make sure that they don't get too powerful or whatever. So that, I think, I'm not so sure that, I think that the tension was more on that line rather than, looking at it as being part of the larger Protestant project. I mean, I think within Protestantism there was, the local Protestants appropriated Protestantism for themselves, and you can say what we want about it today, but I think back then they really were stepping out and taking a stand against and they saw themselves also as being distinct from the Anglo-Americans. So I think it was part of this identity formation that was particular to that time. Yeah.
Any other questions in the room? Oh, time? Okay. Thank you very much.
The bell has rung.
Thank you to all the speakers.
Thank you, Hannah.